Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, and this is today's number two recording. And just like the first one, I'm super excited about this one. It's been a hope that something would come out that would allow me to bring my guest on for a while, since I've seen her work a few times in various places and been very fascinated by the subject matter in general. So I'm very happy to have Erica Pani join me today for this conversation, as she has just published with the University of North Carolina Press a beautiful new book. I love the cover, by the way, too. Torn Asunder: Republican Crises and Civil Wars in the United States and Mexico, 1848 to 1867. Um, and just for those who are interested, Erica has published a number of pieces, articles in Spanish. So if you're speaking Spanish better than me, please check those out. She is working as a research professor at the, hoping that goes right now, Centro de Estudios Históricos at the El Colegio de Mexico. Fairly good, I hope. So first of all, thank you so much for joining today, taking a little time on this day before May 1st for a conversation about your book.
Well, thank you, Neil, so much for having me. Very excited to talk to you.
My pleasure. So you have a lot of publications in Spanish. You have done an article in a edited collection about Mexico and the United States. So what kind of propelled you to write this book? What was kind of the that did you feel like the article wasn't enough? It needed to be bigger, it needed to be more, there was just you needed more space to tell the story?
Well, I have worked on the mid 19th century in Mexico, which is also a very critical moment in
Hmm.
which what the state is going to look like, what the nation is being imagined as changes,
Right.
and kind of goes into this track, which I would argue is the track that we're still on now, on
Hmm.
the nation state, which is territorially grounded with a liberal character of the state, despite the fact that it sometimes goes awry, but so representative, federal, um, capitalist.
Hmm.
Um, I started with the Second Empire, which is this short period where there was this, during a civil war, there was this foreign invasion and monarchical experiment.
Hmm.
And then kind of went out, um, wanted to broaden that the study of that period to include this the War of Reform, the Constitution of 1857, which are part of the same process. Um, I also teach U.S. history,
Hmm.
so I kept seeing these very interesting connections,
Hmm.
parallel processes, um, sometimes, real entanglements. And I was very lucky because when the 150th anniversary of the US Civil War came around, I think US historians had really kind of bet on the
Hmm.
global turn, that
Hmm.
they were taking it seriously. It was not the first time that
Hmm.
the impact of the US Civil War and its connections to the rest of the world were being discussed, but I think that there was a real interest
Hmm.
in really not only looking at the Civil War and its impact
Hmm.
from in and out, but
Hmm.
on connections with different places around the globe. And in 2012, I was invited to a fascinating conference on the American Civil Wars.
Hmm.
How different countries and imperial powers reacted to the US Civil War and how they influenced or not, discussions about slavery, etc. In Colombia, organized by Don Doyle, who had just published his book on, this The Cause of All Nations, which is a really an international
Mhm.
history of the US Civil War. And I went to that conference, and then 2 years later, if I'm not mistaken, to a conference organized by Frank Towers
Mhm.
in Banff, in
Yeah.
Canada. And conversations with colleagues, with
Mhm.
Don, with Frank, with people like Greg Downs, like
Mhm.
Pat Kelly, really made me think. And my American colleagues were insistent that there was something to this period
Mhm.
that it might be worth looking at as a macro region that made
Mhm.
sense for writing history. Um, so it started, I guess, thinking, well, these are parallel processes.
Mhm.
Comparison is gonna be the key
Mhm.
um, methodological approach. But then I think that connections
Mhm.
are also a central part of the story.
Yeah.
Uh, for starters, no, what puts these two republics on the path to civil war? Not inevitable. No, nothing is written
Mhm.
in stone, but we do see this kind of movement
Mhm.
towards greater polarization and
Mhm.
eventually the breakdown of politics and war. Um, is the U.S. Mexico War. Emerson saw it clearly.
Mhm.
Mexico would poison us. Um, so that is an event that is part of a shared history, and that sets off, I
Mhm.
think, this process, which is sometimes run parallel, sometimes, gets entangled. Um, so I was also encouraged, publish this in English,
Mhm.
and that was a little scary,
I can imagine.
but it's also a very different academic culture. So
Mhm.
just the book proposal got like 3 reviews. I was like, um, but and just the working
Mhm.
closely with the press. The
Mhm.
the beautiful cover is all
Yeah.
UNC's doing.
Yeah.
Um, so that was also a very interesting
Mhm.
experience. But it did take, I thought, I've taught this, I've researched the Mexican part, taught the
Mhm.
US part. This, I actually said I would be done. I pitched it, I think, in 2017. I thought I was going to be done by summer of 2020. So now I go far because it took 7 years to write.
Yeah.
But so now it's done, it's out there,
Yeah.
and I hope people read it and find it interesting.
No, it's interesting how long sometimes things take. Like I owe a manuscript to my editor at Georgia, and that's we'll see. Hopefully by the end of middle of the fall, maybe we'll get that done. Hopefully, and yes, I hear you. It can be rather
No, and
rather
books are done when
difficult.
they're done.
Yeah,
No,
no, exactly. And
so
there's oftentimes a lot of revisions that you have to do that people want, and it it is something to. It's not an easy process. Not an easy process. Um, but it it's really interesting that you had these two conferences, you had sort of that encouragement, and you already mentioned Pat Kelly. Um, you also have a few other people in Texas who are working on that borderland material, like Bidori, obviously, as sort of the governors there in northern Mexico. So Mexico, US has always been something of an interest, but it felt like, and I had her on the podcast, gosh, probably 6 months ago or so, Sarah Rodriguez. And the two of you seem to have very similar, yet independently come to these very similar conclusions. So, like, I'm not sure if you have you probably read her book or you kind of were in close contact with each other. How do you think that because how do I phrase it? Like, why do you think that? Like, you think that you both coming from very different backgrounds that you just saw the same thing, and or do you feel like there's enough subtle differences that you disagree with one another?
No, I find Sarah's articles, which I read. I had not come across her work, but Ed Countryman said, you must read this young historian who I think she was a fellow at the Clements Center at SMU,
Mm-hmm.
um, on Texas, which echoes but goes beyond, because it kind of turns the perspective around what
Mm-hmm.
Andrés Reséndez saw. And Andrés Reséndez, when he studied Mexico and I mean, I'm sorry, Texas and New Mexico, saw how, in an age of nation building, in an
Mm-hmm.
age where people were obsessed
Mm-hmm.
with this thing called the nation, which they
Right.
had to construct, were subject to these different tensions and different
Mm-hmm.
influences that had to do with patriotism, but they also had to do with if you could buy alcohol and who sold you medicine, and
Mm-hmm.
with the very strong dynamics of the cotton boom in the
Mm-hmm.
Mississippi Valley, which Andrew Torjet had looked into. And Sarah looks at why U.S. citizens
Mm-hmm.
who were very American in the
Mm-hmm.
terms of what they thought government should be, what citizen rights were, etc. Um, Eric I'm going to murder his last name, Schledereth, also, no, this idea of what citizens have a right to do. They have a right
Mm-hmm.
to move, they have a right to establish themselves, in places where they're supposedly not citizens of, but anyway. So why Mexico, in this case Texas, made sense for these Republican citizens. And how, do you resolve
Mm-hmm.
the living together
Right.
issue, which is
Yeah.
something that we deal with,
Mm-hmm.
I think, every day
Still.
as
Yeah,
political as
still.
political animals, um, through constitution, through
Mm-hmm.
law, through. And I think that what makes Sarah Rodriguez's work and mine connect is that when you are on this space that can, in Sarah's case, is a real territory, there's
Mm-hmm.
ground there,
Mm-hmm.
but also when it's the relationship between the
Mm-hmm.
two nations, one that is so contentious for
Yeah.
Mexico and the US during the first half of the 19th century. Um, that does things to your political
Mm-hmm.
project, and that either pushes it one way or another, gives it a particular shape. um, the book went my book went into the borderlands series,
Mm-hmm.
which I was like, not really Borderlands. And Ben Johnson and Andrew Graber were like, oh no, but this is Borderlands, broadly conceived. Now I'm like, oh, this is very good because
Mm-hmm.
Borderlands, no, this space where you have
Right.
the creation of middle grounds, where you have
Mm-hmm.
overlaps, where you have conflict,
Yeah.
can take place on the ground, no, so
Mm-hmm.
on the lands that are around the border, but they're also virtual in
Mm-hmm.
terms of transnational relations,
Mm-hmm.
diplomatic relations. So in that, I think that it's two different moments also,
Mm-hmm.
no? But I think that they do speak to each other,
Mm-hmm.
and that it works. No,
Mm-hmm.
another author I would point out, which I think, we from very different perspectives, we also saw kind of the same thing as Luis Garcia, no, who
Mm-hmm.
works on the Tejanos, Nuevo León relationship, which
Mm-hmm.
is really, no, they at some point build this region, which is autonomous, does pretty much what it wants to do, and that I think, is kind of what I was looking at, but without this grounded vision
Mm-hmm.
that these authors have.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of what makes this story so interesting, right? That it is it's sort of that intellectual borderlands that you're
Mhm,
engaging with that, but then also the shared experience that exists in sort of the way how the US and Mexico cope with these different challenges, whether that is the nationalism challenge of how do we define ourselves, or the Republican liberal challenge of how do we craft our form of government.
mhm. No, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, and it's a story of the Americas, and
Hmm.
it's a
Yeah.
story, no, of republics. I think,
Hmm.
no, that this the contingency of republic
Hmm.
is something that these American nations have to face
Hmm.
throughout the 19th century and into the 20th,
That's actually a good
maybe the
point.
21st.
Yeah, I would actually say yes to that for sure. There's an interesting point that you just brought up because you said it's a challenge that the Americas face, right? It's not just Mexico and the United States. It's Colombia, it's Peru, it's Argentina. To some level, it is even Brazil, even though it's a monarchy. So I guess speculatively, why is it that we have a lot of works on the Mexican U.S. borderland relationships, interactions, comparisons, but we have nothing for the South. Like we have James Sanders who did a little bit with regard to Colombia recently, but we really don't have anything sort of thinking of like how is the U.S. experience and say the Peruvian experience or the Argentinian experience the same.
Um, I would say that there is an amazing monograph on American republics, which is Hilda Sabatos.
Hmm, okay.
First, which is interesting, she first published the book in English,
Hmm. I
and
missed
it's
that one.
called Republics of the New World. And then she published the book in Spanish, and she's an amazing Argentinian historian,
Hmm.
um, who very much draws on how independence really creates a new
Mm-hmm.
political culture, a new set of beliefs, and that all these formerly Spanish American,
Mm.
formerly Spanish
Colonies.
colonies
Let's just go with that.
um,
Yeah.
uh, have to
Mm.
create, no, and it's this huge laboratory, and
Mm.
there's, I would say, Marcela Ternavasio, Carmen Macaboy in Peru. So I think that there is this very interesting literature on republicanism, which has very little to do with what I think the English
Mm-hmm.
literature on Republican, which was so kind of obsessed with with civic humanism
Yeah.
and this very, very, very long intellectual
Mm-hmm.
legacy, rather than what is this thing that we are building
Mm-hmm.
that we call a republic.
Yeah.
And Brazil kind of gets into that because
Mm-hmm.
the foundations of the Brazilian Empire are also contingent.
Right.
Well, they are. There's the decision of
Mm.
the prince that says no, I will remain. But that empire that he
Mhm.
creates
Yeah.
is it's a new thing. It's not
Mhm.
part of what it was during the
Yeah.
colonial period.
Yeah. No. Ooh, now I have some books that I need to look up and authors to look up. This is
No, it's
great.
a very really fascinating dynamic.
Hmm.
The I guess 80s, 90s
Hmm.
completely uh, a very fresh approach
Hmm.
to independence, no? Tulio
Yeah.
Alperín,
Yeah.
François Xavier Guerra, Antonio Anino, Jaime Rodriguez,
Hmm.
really, I think, changed the way we looked at
Hmm.
politics in 19th century Spanish America, which was kind of, oh, first of all, it's chaos,
Hmm.
and it is a very turbulent
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Uh, but these corrupt
Hmm.
politicians, caudillos on horseback, and they're kind of, playing the game of
Hmm.
liberal politics, but this isn't really real.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that we do understand the 19th century better
Hmm.
thanks to this
Mm.
twist in the historiography that has, reverberated across how we look at the 19th century
Mm.
writ large.
Now I have to reread Rodriguez's work. Probably should do that anyways because I gave that to my students. I teach in the
Ah,
IB program,
yeah.
and we
Ah,
did a for the history curriculum. I did the independence unit and did
mhm,
Bolivar and Colombia, and Jaime Rodriguez was one of the guys that I actually gave them to read and look at because I thought it was a good study to kind of get a sense of what
mhm.
Bolivar in Colombia. So now I have to go back and look at that again, which is good. I like that book actually. Um, so since we're in this historiography a little bit, I kind of wanted to get a sense because I'm an English speaker. I speak German. I don't speak a lot of Spanish. So you have done, as you said earlier, a lot of work in Spanish with regard to Mexico, this 19th century Mexican moment of Guerrero reform and then the imperial part of that. So can you give me and the listeners a sense of like what is sort of the historiographical conversation in Mexico? What's the opinion on uh, Maximiliano? What's sort of the thought process on Juarez? The this entire period it is like in the U.S. Maximilian sort of like looked down upon, like, oh, this European French imposed colonial experiment. But how do you in Mexico talk about it? What's sort of the
So
story?
that is, it's an interesting question because I think there's a different, the here history and memory are
Hmm.
really divergent.
Mm, okay.
Um, so the reform period, which goes from 1855 to 1867, no, to the fall of
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
empire, where really you have, because it's true that Mexican politics in the 19th century are violence. It's
Hmm.
true that pronunciamientos are the favored method of doing politics. But as Will Fowler has shown, there is a logic to the madness, and
Hmm.
that logic breaks down during the Civil War. No,
Hmm.
it's a
Right.
war that is terribly violent, that kind
Hmm.
of that divides the country in two, that
Hmm.
divides families,
Hmm.
splits up friendships, etc.
Hmm.
And then there's this weird uh, moment of a French emperor who wants to restore
Hmm.
French presence in the New World and who has this, utopian socialist idea about canals and steamships and trains, um, who decides to partner with this very desperate
Hmm.
group of Mexican politicians who
Hmm.
desperately, I'm sorry to be redundant, wants to restore the Catholic, moral,
Hmm.
natural foundations of the Republic.
Right.
Um, with this Austrian prince, no, who makes
Hmm.
sense for French diplomacy. No, they
Hmm.
had
Yeah.
defeated, participated, supported Italian unification. So, did not do well.
Hmm.
Did not do right in the opinion of the Austrians for the to the Austrian Empire.
Hmm.
Um, and yes, he's a descendant of the Catholic kings, but really has no connection.
Hmm.
So what we see in Mexican historiography, this is a period that is absolutely critical
Hmm.
for Mexican nation building.
Hmm.
It is Mexico's heroic moment
Hmm.
because we were
Hmm.
defeated by the US.
Hmm.
Mexico lost half of its territory. And in the 1860s, Mexico fights off the European imperialism, and it claims, as Justo Sierra, the great 19th century historian, says, we Mexico won its right to be an
Hmm.
independent nation, to join the ranks of the international concert. Um, Surprisingly, there has been less interest by professional historians, so
Hmm.
second half of the 20th century,
Hmm.
uh, to revise what this meant, what it,
Hmm.
so the empire was is a harebrained scheme. Napoleon III is a horrible villain. Maximilian is nice, but he's an idiot. Um, and and it's kind of this, and I have insisted and said this a lot, so I need to find a new expression. It's thought of as a kind of a parenthesis in national history. So what's really important is the Republican struggle against conservatives, the church, and the French. And this, and the empire is just this fluff, people are being ridiculous. They're, hanging ribbons on their jackets and wanting
Make
to
good
be.
movies though.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is that I think that the
Mm.
memory of the empire through movies,
Hmm.
through soap operas,
Yeah.
and this amazing
Mm.
historical novel, which is Fernando del Paso's News from the Empire,
Mm.
which is, if you have not read it, I highly recommend it. Um, there is this romantic, um, sympathetic vision of the
Mm.
empire because Maximiliano and Carlota had good intentions. They were led astray by the horrible conservatives and the more horrible French.
Mm.
They loved Mexico. No, the
Mm.
fact that Maximilian is very brave at the moment of his execution, and prays for his blood to be the last to be shed for
Mm.
his new country. Um, they're soap opera heroes. They're
Mm.
heroes of novels. She goes
Mm.
crazy, so no, this major tragedy.
Mm.
And I think that regular Mexican, everyday Mexicans,
Mm.
do not think Maximilian is a horrible person who came
Mm.
and was imposed, and they think he was, misled, and that
Mm.
he actually really liked Mexico, and that
Mm.
makes him kind of a Mexican icon.
Mm.
I would say tragic hero,
Mm.
not patriotic hero.
Yeah.
Um, there's been a lot written on the empire, but it kind of repeated the same
Okay.
things.
Mm.
And I think has changed in the last 20 years. That people have started looking at different
Mm.
different actors.
Mm.
The why a recent thesis at El Colegio, which is now a wonderful book by Hector Strober, how did they recruit?
Mhm.
Um, what were regular soldiers, but especially the officers answering
Mm.
to. There is also a new vision of the French,
Mm.
some of the officers were very unhappy to be there. They thought their
Mm.
alliance was unnatural because they were liberal, like the liberals they were fighting against. Um, there is an interesting indigenous policy
Mhm.
that the empire deploys. How do indigenous communities respond to that?
Mm.
So there is this I think renewal by
Mm.
young historians of another great book on how the there is a kind of interesting way to organize public assistance, no?
Yeah. Mm.
Taking care of orphans, the
Mhm.
sick,
Mhm.
etc., which is put under the authority of the empress.
Mhm.
So which tries to bring together the efforts of civil society, the church, and the government,
Mm.
which in the midst of secularization that the liberals were trying to
Mm.
establish was not an option. So
Mm.
this is a brief moment where like the three of them under the guidance of this very young woman
Mm.
um, would had interesting things to
Mm.
offer. So I think that qualifies the very rosy picture of the tragic heroes,
Mm.
but it is more interesting and just showing that there are a lot of projects that Mexican politicians had been working on
Mm.
that had not come to fruition
Mm.
that are once again put on the table during the
Mm.
empire. Again, they
Mm.
don't come to fruition, but they're there. No, that it is a
Yeah.
Mexican regime,
Yeah.
despite the fact that it is,
Mhm.
imposed by French bayonets, which is
Mhm.
you do not discuss with that.
Mhm. No, but I think that's a really interesting point that you're noting there, that it is a Mexican regime, because so many times in especially US scholarship, when Mexico comes up in some form during the Civil War period, it sort of oftentimes sounds of like, oh, this is Napoleon extending the empire, and the Mexicans are sort of pawns, but they're not really the
Mhm.
actors in it. But and I really appreciate that in your book, but then also it was the Habsburg on the Rio Grande book that
Mhm.
indicating that no, this is very much Mexican driven. This is a Mexican conservative effort with this Austrian playing a role and French soldiers playing a role. Um, so I find that very, very refreshing, very nice. Thank you.
No, perhaps one, and I'm responsible for this as much as some of my colleagues, but the fact that it was a war, or the
Hmm.
fact that,
Yeah.
and we kind of, seduced by the very interesting thing that politicians are doing, you
Hmm.
kind of forget, but it is this, in the
Yeah.
midst of violence
Mm.
that this is going on.
Yeah. And speaking of that violence, since I have a Mexican on the podcast, I can actually ask this. Like, I I stumbled on it once. Cinco de Mayo, the movie that was made in Mexico,
Mhm.
and it so speaks almost to that older cliche way of thinking of the French that you mentioned earlier, and the less sort of the revised version of it, because I can't remember the French general's name, but he's sort of presented as this like caricature of like ambition and arrogance, and it like just total supremacy that he's suggesting, right? And you have sort of the other side, that the Mexican side, that is really grounded, that we're the people that are fighting against this shadowy French enemy.
Which I would say is there is some truth to that. The commander of the French troops, who
Mm-hmm.
go in as this supposedly very 19th century gunboat diplomacy, so that
Mm-hmm.
the financially responsible republic will pay its debt.
Mm-hmm.
There is a treaty that is signed, where Mexico
Mm-hmm.
says that it will give up part of its tariff revenue, etc. And the British and the Spaniards go back, and the French, who are interested in regime change, stay.
Mm-hmm.
The commander is General Lawrences, and
Yeah.
he does feel,
Mm-hmm.
no, he writes with 5,000 soldiers, if I'm not mistaken. I am the master of Mexico, and his colleagues who come
Mm-hmm.
after, because what happens after the defeat in Puebla is that the French have to fashion their strategy and send reinforcements, and they send the colonial troops. And for people like Elie Fauré and people like Achille Bazin, who are the commanders after Lawrences is a general of a lace general, or
Mm-hmm.
a general that is more
Yeah.
that not like the hardened
Mm-hmm.
officials
Yeah.
who conquered Algeria, participated in the Indochina expedition. So that there is a truth to that. I think that the depiction of the French as absolutely villainous and vile and base is contradicted by
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the social relationships that were established
Yeah.
between officers and members of the
Mm-hmm.
of the elite. And I think that it reflects different moments in
Mm-hmm.
Mexican history. The very famous movie Juarez with Betty
Mm-hmm.
Davis, the French are the Nazis. No, that's what they're modeled
Mm-hmm.
on.
Yeah.
And as always, no, they are an invading army. They opt for strategies that are beyond the pale of
Mm-hmm.
the laws of war. No, they use guerrilla. They have anti-guerrilla units
Mm-hmm.
that use guerrilla tactics that go against civilian population, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But as is always the case, some are good, some are bad, and there's mostly, in the middle, and it depends on when.
Right. Yeah. And It's yeah, but we'll leave it at that. I think we want to focus more on most of our conversation. I think will be focused sort of more on the Mexican side today because that's what I'm personally most interested in, and most viewers and listeners will know about the US side, so they can piece the things together. But I think what really struck me in the early part of your book was that interplay between what does it mean to be Mexican, right? And sort of like how how do you frame a a a colony, a diverse set of people into something that thinks of themselves as we're one people? How do you do that?
I think that that's one of the big challenges that these men and women, most of the people who are writing and doing
Mhm,
legislating, etc., are men. Um, but I think that what's interesting is that they go from a very legal,
mhm,
um, very legal and political construction of the nation. So, what is the nation? The nation is the sovereign.
mhm,
The nation is the political community that has taken over, received, been transferred,
mhm,
the sovereignty of the king, which
right,
is, I
yeah,
think, is something that happens with the independence revolution.
mhm,
And there's no going back. No, Mexican constitutions begin with the proclamation of the sovereignty of the nation.
mhm,
And then they have to determine, what are they talking about? Are they talking about the territory? Are they talking
mhm,
about the different sovereign
mhm,
states? Are they talking about a Mexican people?
mhm,
Um, so that I think is central. The how do foreigners become Mexicans
mhm,
is a very new world solution, very similar to that of the States and to most other Spanish American republics, which is, people who want to live there,
mhm,
who renounce their old former allegiance, and who swear to obey the laws and defend the Constitution, etc. During the first half of the 19th century, very important that they should be Catholic,
mhm,
because that's that
mhm,
it's a Catholic republic, and that's what makes people members of the same community. So it is
mhm,
this, James Kettner's volitional
mhm,
allegiance. To become Mexican, you have to want to be a
mhm,
Mexican, and then there's things that you have to be of good standing, have be moral, have good character, etc. But it's a very short process. No, it's between it's 5 years, but
mhm,
you have to let them know
yeah,
by after 2 years, um, after 2 years of residence, etc. Um, and this political allegiance and citizens as the holders of
mhm,
sovereignty does not work sufficiently well.
mhm,
And I think the war with the US is seen by members of the Mexican elite, despite the fact that there was mobilization. Peter Guardino has shown that there was mobilization, that there is popular patriotism, etc.
mhm,
They don't win any battles, but
right,
but he Mariano Otero, who's this great intellectual deputy constitution drafter, etc., says, Mexico lost because Mexico is not a nation, and it's not a
mhm,
nation because we're not a family. So
mhm,
there needs to be this creation of stronger ties.
mhm,
And I think that the liberals in 1850, 56, 57 are convinced that the way to do this is to create rights that will be upheld.
mhm,
So, on the one hand, to give power to the people. So it's contradictory as all these things are, because they establish universal male suffrage. There's this strange thing about Mexican citizenship where it's a subjective quality. You have to be a man of good character. And who decides? Well, the people at the voting booth.
Right.
So recognized by your community as, an upstanding neighbor. But power to the people. So the Supreme Court will be elected, as will the president, as are the members of the legislative power, which is one assembly.
Mhm.
There's no Senate. It will be restored later, but this idea of one
Mhm.
nation,
One person.
indivisible, and so it should be represented as such.
Mhm.
Uh, and the elections for power to the people. But since they don't trust the Mexican people, there
Mhm.
are voices that are calling for
Mhm.
democratic government. But most of the Constitution, the deputies working on the Constitution maintain indirect elections. No,
Mhm.
so citizens vote for electors, and electors vote for everyone else. Um, so one of the big innovations is there is this Bill of Rights, and the federal judiciary will be charged with enforcing and guaranteeing those rights. But what we also see in this period is the enactment, because it's not the creation, it's the enactment of the the story of Mexican patriotism. No,
Mhm.
so the Mexican people coming together as one to
Mhm.
fight off the French invader,
Mhm.
and that becomes the national narrative.
Mhm.
After in 1867, practically you have these Mexican historians writing about how the Mexican people saved the nation, and that will be the narrative that will be taught in schools, that
Mhm.
will be written about, that will be celebrated. No, you celebrate May the 5th, you celebrate April the 2nd, which is when
Mhm.
Puebla was liberated for the second time. You celebrate the 16th of September, which is when the popular uprising for
Mhm.
independence started. So it's a narrative that flattens out
Mhm.
conflict, that like all 19th century stories of the nation. But that I think is more effective in creating feelings of nationalism,
Mhm.
um, than this political vision of
Mhm.
rights-bearing citizens
Mhm.
who are um, who will be defended
Mhm.
by the federal state,
Mhm.
which is it is put into
Mhm.
action, or you do have these mothers who go to the courts because they have taken their son into the army without his being willing to go.
Mhm.
But there is, I think, this creation of a national memory that is effective.
Mhm. Mhm. And would
We
you,
never know how people receive it. No, it's very
right.
difficult to see, but it's there and it looks like it's working.
Yeah, no, I kind of one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking was sort of like the notion of Benedict Anderson's imagined community, right? Of like that, how much is what is created and thought about at the top actually filtering down to the average Mexicano in
Mhm.
even in Sonora, right? Like maybe in Mexico City it works, but will it work in the outlying areas? Um, so that's a big kind of what if, I suppose, of like how good is that? But the other part I was thinking too is that when you were talking about how the struggle against the empire really kind of helps foster a sense of family, of national unity. And I seem to remember that I can't remember which book it was, but also kind of talking about how the defeat of Mexico by the United States in 46, 48 also kind of starts to create that sense of like, okay, what went wrong? What do we need to do differently? And sort of you already like, yes, the imperial period will create heroes, but you also already create heroes, like the defenders of Chapultepec in that conflict. So is it is it a combination of the two that really kind of helps, or is it? like a kernel is laid with U.S. conflict, and then really the burst comes um, with the French.
No, I think that the one of the things that can help us see how this is gelling.
Hmm.
The first project for that is widely read for a national history that goes from the pre-Hispanic period to the present
Hmm.
is drafted during the Empire, is presented
Mm, okay.
in one of the academies.
Mm,
But it doesn't come together until the 1880s. No?
mm,
Uh, Before that, we have very,
mm. It's like
colorful,
short little
interesting
things. Yeah.
histories of independence,
Mm,
histories of what Jose Maria Luis Mora, this great liberal, is going to
hmm.
describe Mexico's revolutions,
Hmm.
um, of the struggle against the struggle against the U.S.
Hmm.
And then of the struggle against the French,
Mm.
but it doesn't come
Like
together
all.
as a coherent tale
Mm.
until the 1880s
Mm.
under the um, assumption and model and under the pen of the men who lived through the struggle against the French and the
Mm.
conservatives, the French and the Empire.
Mm.
It's interesting because there's two multi-volume histories that come
Mm.
to be at more or less the same time. One is a Spaniard's, Niceto de Zamacois,
Mhm.
who offers a very moderate, conservative
Mm.
leaning, Catholic
Mhm.
sympathetic story, and then the liberal
Mm.
version, which will be the canonical version.
Mm. Mm.
So I do think that the Mexican-American War is crucial
Mm.
exactly because of what you said. No, people are saying, where did we go wrong and what do we need to
Mm.
fix?
Mhm.
And what we see is politicians
Mm.
radicalizing their political projects. So
Mhm.
what we need is order. So what we need is a dictatorship. Oh no, what we need is freedom. So
Mm.
the Ayutla Rebellion.
Yeah.
What we need is to modernize the country and to
Mm.
rid it of its colonial legacies
Mm.
and to put the citizens at the center. And that also requires making them
Mm.
prosperous. No.
Mhm.
If citizens are miserably poor, which is the case
Right.
for many Mexicans
Mhm.
in the 19th century, the republic will mean nothing. So we need to transform them into
Mhm.
property holding yeomen.
Mhm.
Did not use this word. So that's why we need to disentail
Mhm.
corporate land, or the corporate land of the church. So there are these, and then on the other hand, you have the conservatives
Mhm.
saying very reactively after a civil war, which they have lost, is we need the help of Europe
Mhm.
and we need a monarchy.
Yeah, and in part, I want to stick with the nationalism for just a second, but before we go into the republicanism, because associated with that is sort of like it. I mean, it starts before sort of the conflict with the U.S., but you have the separation of Yucatan as well, sort of this sense of belonging that goes to the extreme of like, well, I don't feel I belong, so I will leave, right? And you had that in Texas on some level, and I guess Vidari would fit into that as well on some levels. That how much is it that it's personal ambition or sort of a real sense of like I don't feel like I belong or I want more power for myself?
Yeah, I think Vidaurri is a fascinating character. Um, and I think that I personally, I'm still of two minds about
Hmm.
him. I don't think when he offers the Confederate envoy,
Hmm.
that, oh, maybe we could join the Confederacy. I think he's kind of, you know seeing how he can leverage what has become a very important
Hmm.
trade route for Confederate cotton, and to see what he can get. But I don't think was seriously thinking about joining the Confederacy. And I think Jefferson Davis's
Mm.
response
Ah,
is, very logical. And
yeah.
but in the case of the Yucatecos, I also find that it's um, and how I remember Justo Flores uh, has this very good book on
Mhm.
Yucatecan separatism. And what he argues, I think convincingly, is that Yucatecan nationalism is also a negotiating tool.
Mhm.
What they're doing is
Mhm.
Yucatan has a very strong relationship, commercial relationship with the Caribbean,
Mhm.
a very strong tradition of autonomous commercial policies. So
Mhm.
no tariffs, no.
Right.
So it does find that the center is, central Mexico is imposing
Mm.
its visions on what are its vital interests. It also has a big conflict between two cities, Merida
Mm.
and Campeche. So the 18, these efforts to separate the peninsula from the nation are there is definitely no
Mhm.
a lot of parts that have this intention, but some of them that are kind of trying to pressure Mexico City.
Mhm.
The caste war kind of blows things up
Mhm. Mhm.
because the white elite feels completely overwhelmed and spins this rebellion as a caste war and as a struggle between
Mhm.
barbarism and civilization.
Mm.
And whoever will help them put this down, they will appeal to. And that's why Justo
Mm.
Sierra O'Reilly goes to the US and says, we will give up Yucatecan sovereignty. But
Mm.
it is a very desperate move.
Right.
But it's true that there is no, because of the way sovereignty
Mm.
works in the minds of people, there is no natural national community.
Mhm.
And if you have a political community that decides that they need to go elsewhere,
Mhm.
like in Texas, like in Yucatan, the case of Central America is fascinating because
Mhm.
when the Central American cities decided that they did not want to belong to the Mexican Empire, then slash transition to republic, um, they, the Mexican government holds this plebiscite, which is run through municipal governments,
Mm.
where you have a mobilization of the interests in Chiapas that are more interested in keeping their relations, again, commercial and
Mhm.
economic, with Oaxaca than
Mhm.
with Central America. So
Right.
Chiapas stays. And then Mexico invades the Soconusco and claims it as theirs, and that it remains. So you have
Mhm.
Mexican territory in the southeast, which is Mexican by choice from the 1820s, and then that was taken away by
Mhm.
violent action and occupation in the
Mhm.
1840s by the Mexican government. So I
Mhm.
think it shows kind of the two faces of
Mhm.
what sovereignty can
Mhm.
do in terms of the creation of political communities
Right.
that have to fit this national mold.
Mhm. Wow. I learned so much in the few minutes that you were talking. Um, Makes me sometimes realize how little I know about other country's history, which is good. So let's think about. I want to turn towards and it's been already on and off in the conversation, but I really want to talk about the republicanism aspect as well, because that's a key part of what is taking place, whether it's Ayutla as the kind of um, the starting point, the reform conflict, and then the empire, right? And in part, it feels like what Mexico is here. Mexico makes, or the Mexican liberals makes this argument that Catholicism is left over a remnant of the colonial period.
Mhm.
And I'm kind of thinking in Europe, Sonnerbundskrieg, and then you have eventually Bismarck with sort of his Kulturkampf. But there's also in sort of the liberal mind this notion of Catholicism is or Catholics in general are untrustworthy. We don't know where their allegiance lies. Are they loyal to the Pope? Are they loyal to the new states? Are they loyal to the systems of government? So, like, how do Mexicans reconcile that? Do they talk about these influences from Europe of like this new idea of like trust in the new liberal states, Republican states?
Yeah. No, I think that this is a time period where um, Catholicism is, I would say, an essential part of identity. The
Mm-hmm.
church is a public institution. It keeps order. It has courts that decide on legacies, on certain
Mm-hmm.
conflicts. It is a large
Right.
owner, less of land. The liberals had this idea that they owned half the land and that, but they own very valuable property, especially in the cities. But it is a cultural powerhouse. It does a lot of the education, etc. Um, and I would say it's not Catholic, except for very few exceptions of radical liberals, Ignacio Ramirez, who
Mm-hmm.
thought God didn't exist. But they are committed Catholics,
Mm-hmm.
but some think that the church is not doing the
Mm-hmm.
job that it should be doing,
Mm-hmm.
which makes it more, in many ways, more difficult because the position is not like, it's a colonial legacy. We don't know where
Right.
the allegiance of these people lies. You
Right.
know, let's what they think they're doing when they disentail church property, when they take church jurisdiction away
Mm-hmm.
in civil cases, when they um, want to establish freedom of religion, really
Mm-hmm.
of the cult, not to be
Right.
able to practice your religion
Mm-hmm.
more or less in public in the country. Is the image they have is a church that is humble, a church that is devoted to the poor and to its pastoral duties.
Mm-hmm.
And what the Catholics, militant Catholics, and the church bishops answer is, we are a perfect community. Are, we were founded by the Son of God. We are separate and over the state. So that I think makes for a more explosive
Mm-hmm.
confrontation. Another thing that I think happens, the Pope does not recognize Mexican independence for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
So the Mexican
Mm-hmm.
church kind of reorganizes itself. It is battered by independence, but it remains, kind of solid. And by the mid 19th century, with 1848, there there is this feeling of threat, of danger, and the appeal to the universal church, the authority of the Pope, and we will see Pius the Ninth, no, declare
Mm-hmm.
papal infallibility a few years, and the syllabus, which is
Mm-hmm.
very, because it makes liberal Catholicism, I don't know how to say it because it's not theologically impossible, but um, doctrinally
Mm-hmm.
impossible, which
Yeah.
had been central. Catholicism had been central to
Mm-hmm.
Mexican liberalism. So that I think the fact that the reformers are also Catholic
Mm-hmm.
makes it I think more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, what the Mexican bishops will realize is that the separation of church and state is also a good thing for the church.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I think that is a knot that is kind of
Mm-hmm.
cut effectively. My 20th century colleagues would say no, because then you wouldn't have had the Cristero War, which is
Mm,
this Catholic insurrection, which is in the 1920s, which is a
mm,
very serious conflict. But it is true that one of the things, it fails miserably, but there
mm,
is an effort to create a Mexican Apostolic Church independent
mm.
from the Roman. So it is a
Yeah.
fascinating part of this story,
Mm,
which I think has been very productively
mm,
explored, by Pablo Mijangos, by Matthew Butler. There
mm.
are a lot of interesting, Brian Connaughton, very
Yeah.
interesting things that have been written about this.
Yeah, no, that's it's always more complicated than it appears. And that's definitely is the case here too. And the other part that kind of going back to some of the things you mentioned earlier now, thinking in the kind of Republican sense, electoral systems, right? That the Mexican indirect electoral system that you're having. And that I think is very much again sort of that classical liberal thinking of that time of we don't trust the people necessarily, so we're going to separate them from the holders of power with the step of electors. The same thing like the US does with the president, right? So it's like it seems in many ways that Mexican liberals are very traditional in some of the ways they're approaching the organization of politics.
I do think that this is a transatlantic,
Hmm.
uh, no,
Yeah.
but they're reading, they're looking
Hmm.
at other experiences, the U.S. experience, no,
Hmm. Yeah.
in a very, I think, pointed way, and they use the U.S. as the example and the counterexample of why things should be
Hmm.
one way or another. Uh, but I do think that these conservatives
Hmm.
do not have the choice of going back. No? So
Hmm.
they come up with these schemes that, we need to have a Congress that represents
Hmm.
classes. So that
Hmm.
represents, landowners and
Right.
industrialists and miners and the liberal,
Hmm.
which of course there's no way that
It's
thing can
not.
work. Um, the empire, which there's this big discussion, which I think is kind of a waste of time, about how liberal is Maximilian. So
Hmm.
I'm sorry,
I've seen that one. Yes.
he holds the legislative power, he holds the executive power,
Hmm.
and there is this idea of having a constitution,
Hmm.
which is a very it's a constitution where the emperor keeps having, because there's three
Hmm.
representative bodies, one of whom is kind of the notables of the empire. Then there's this um, body where he designates people, and then there's an elected body. So sorry, not and they decide not to put on this constitution. So not very liberal. Um, very anti-cleric, well, reasonably
Hmm.
anti-cleric. I mean, probably
Hmm.
liberal if you compare him to Franz Joseph. But
That's a bad comparison.
but he does, the empire maintains
Yeah.
municipal elections,
Hmm.
and there is this reflex of, no, we have to ask the sovereign nation.
Hmm.
So they have this, it's not a plebiscite because it again goes through the municipal bodies,
Hmm.
but this idea that, very
Yeah.
much executed by the French army, that, do you want to belong to the empire? Oh, yes, this
Hmm.
is a very good idea. No, we look to the great grandson
Hmm.
of Charles V, when we were so happy during colonial
Hmm.
times, etc. So there is this a political culture that cannot give popular sovereignty up
Hmm.
completely, despite the fact that politicians would like to. So I would say that Mexican liberals are not particularly traditional,
Hmm.
but that they are part of this transatlantic conversation of
Hmm.
how do you organize
Hmm.
a stable government based on the fickleness of popular sovereignty, of the people's will.
Mm-hmm.
So that I think, and the what the conservatives will say for a short while
Mm-hmm.
is these are ridiculous premises. And what we need is to have, there is no such thing as a general will because
Mm-hmm.
society is full of conflicts. And what we need to have is groups kind of
Mm-hmm.
go coming in and out of government. No, and we
Mm-hmm.
have two parties: the one that wants to go ahead, the one
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't want to go ahead so
Mm-hmm.
fast, and that's what we should have.
Mm-hmm.
But this kind of deteriorates as the liberal project radicalizes, and
Yeah,
they end up with an authoritarian solution.
yeah, we'll see how much we get to that, but it's interesting in that kind of sense, and I kind of was thinking in terms of like also in how much is Mexico actually debating, especially universal manhood suffrage during
Mhm.
this time? Are obviously the conservatives are not gonna, I would assume, saying we should do that, but how much is there a desire if you're saying there's a lot of mistrust
Um,
of the of the populace?
okay, so there's mistrust, but there's also enthusiasm.
Mm-hmm.
No, one of the things that I think happens with the war is that um, negative visions of
Mm-hmm.
soldiers
Mm-hmm.
uh, are very much nuanced during this time
Mm-hmm.
period. And for the US, you have this very, I would say, much less controversial decision that it might have been at times of peace of soldiers on the field can vote. They
Mm-hmm.
have the right to vote. In Mexico, you don't see it because Republican life comes apart during the war,
Mm-hmm.
but you do see elements of the popular classes.
Mm-hmm.
So soldiers who have been recruited in the countryside, which are described with horror by some of the observers that see them come into Mexico City. But then you see the engravings and the paintings that were done,
Mm-hmm.
and they are very dignified. They are heroic,
Mm-hmm.
disciplined,
Mm-hmm.
well dressed,
Mm-hmm.
clean. So I think that it goes both ways. On the one hand, there is this mistrust. On the
Mm-hmm.
other, there is this um, interest and recognition on
Mm-hmm.
one hand, and then the interest of depicting the Mexican citizen, the regular Mexican citizen, as someone who is entitled to
Mm-hmm.
these rights, but who will also exercise them um, democratically,
Mm-hmm.
responsibly, taking into account his interest, the interest of the nation, patriotically. So in that no in that in
Mm-hmm.
that that I think is something that's going on in conversations and in representations. There is no discussion. Mexican suffrage is very open
Mm-hmm.
since the very beginning because it comes to life in the context of war.
Mm-hmm.
So in the context of war, you don't want people feeling left out.
Right. Yeah.
So since
Mm-hmm.
the establishment of the Spanish Constitution of Cadiz, who can
Mm-hmm.
vote? All citizens can
Also.
vote, and citizens are upstanding men who
Mm-hmm.
are 21 years of age
Mm-hmm.
or married, no, so heads
Yeah.
of family who are recognized by their neighbors as
Mm-hmm.
upstanding members of the community.
Yeah.
And there's exceptions. They
Mm-hmm.
can't be servants, or they can be servants, but they if they serve directly, then they can. Priests can vote, yes, but members of the religious orders can vote because they're not
Mm-hmm.
autonomous. Poisoners, those
Mm-hmm.
who make false, those are excluded.
Mm-hmm.
Drunkards, but it's a
Mm-hmm.
very open system, which they will try to at some points they will try to restrict to men who have a certain amount of
Mm-hmm.
property or of income, but that actually creates a lot of
Mm.
tensions, especially in the countryside. So
Yeah.
you will see two constitutions in the 30s and the 40s that restrict suffrage, but in general, no,
Yeah.
it's very open. And in the 1856-57 Constituent Congress, there is this restriction, which is very common
Hmm.
in electoral law, which is because it's not the fault of the people that they don't know how to read and write, we will allow them to vote even if they're illiterate
Mm.
for a few years, and
Right.
then we will establish a literacy requirement.
Mm.
And what the constituents say is, this is ridiculous because you don't have to being able to read and write does not make
Mhm.
you a better person or a better citizen. Or
Right.
so we will take that away, and then
Mm.
yeah, it's done, and it's a very
Mhm.
non-controversial issue.
Right.
All the constituents are all identify themselves as liberals because they
Mhm.
are the results of elections that took place after the Ayutla
Mm.
Revolution, which put an end to the conservative dictatorial experiment. So the conservatives are very um, under the weather and have lost much of their prestige.
Mhm.
Um,
It is so an irony when you think of it, because yes, the conservatives were authoritarian and he has the empire, but we do have to admit Juarez also did kind of stay in power after his term technically expired, and there were calls for him to call for an election or step down and be replaced by the new Supreme Court justice. So it can, like, I guess it's sort of the question, like in the US there's oftentimes these excuses of like Lincoln did these things because it's a time of war and he has to act in an emergency. Can we do the same with Juarez and say because it's an emergency situation, he is balled up in the very north, he can't hold an election effectively in the country?
no, which I think was a fact, no,
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
the election. Um, and I do think that we need to take into account not only what the law says and
Hmm.
how principled or unprincipled we think our historical actors are,
Hmm.
but the fact that this is politics in the terms of a dispute for power
Hmm.
and that they will use, you know, these aspects of the political system, so
Hmm.
elections, the law, in order to maintain or attain power. So in 1865, when Juarez's constitutional term runs out, he does refuse to. No, he says, "I was
Hmm.
given full emergency powers by Congress before Congress got dissolved in San Luis Potosí, and this allows me to remain in power." But the first thing he does in 1861, when the liberal government that had been in Veracruz, the liberals when the Reform War, goes back to Mexico, and when he goes back to Mexico City in 1867,
Hmm.
is call for elections.
Hmm.
And here we see this very interesting and intelligent use of the popular will
Hmm.
as this ultimate legitimating
Yeah,
element.
yeah.
What Juarez does in 67 is what Comonfort wanted
Hmm.
to do in 1857 when he said this
Right.
constitution doesn't work because it so weakens the president and it's too polemical, it's too
Hmm.
controversial. In 67, not only is it not controversial, it is the constitution that the people, fought and died for this.
Hmm.
So this is the banner of the republic and of the nation. But what he's aware of is we need to strengthen the executive. Reforming the Constitution is hard.
Hmm.
So what we're going to do is we're going to ask the people.
Right.
And he has these questions. No, do you think that we should have a Senate? Do you think that? Which it doesn't work because it's not, people don't understand it. The liberals
Hmm.
are terribly critical of it.
Hmm.
Um, but what we see is kind of what we see with Napoleon III. what we see with Santan and Maximilian is, oh no, we need to ask the people if they are, if they're good with this. Um, and and it's interesting because, and this is it's I might be reading too much into this, but in the last months of the empire, when the military situation is already very bad, etc.,
Hmm.
there's two imperialists, one who is this engineer who really is not a particularly rabid conservative, but who does think that the empire is a good idea, and Teodosio Lares, who is a very consistent conservative throughout the second half of the 19th century. They're saying, what should we do? It's like, well, what we need to do is Juarez and Maximilian need to kind of step back, and we need to hold elections for a new Congress, for a new constitution. He says, but the elections have to be direct.
Hmm.
So here you have these conservatives calling for
Hmm.
popular elections direct.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
what I think they're realizing is that the Liberal Party is a lot better at
Hmm.
organizing than
Hmm.
they are.
Yeah.
Are they democratic? No.
Hmm. Right.
But this is what we have. This is what we have to
Hmm.
work with, and we do need this extra um, condition so that
Hmm.
we won't be run over by the
Hmm.
more efficient party men of the liberals.
Yeah, no, and I'm really glad you kind of said that, right? That it's very few people at this time who are democratic, right? That's it's like it's a very, very uncommon saying to.
I would disagree just in
Okay, good.
terms of how the new world is
Hmm.
working, and I do think that you do have a significant group of politicians who
Hmm.
are um, want to move towards democracy,
Hmm. I would agree with
but
that. Yeah.
also, and that I think Jose Antonio Aguilar has written on this, Elisa Cárdenas has written on this for the case of Mexico, is that there is this exaltation of the people, there is
Hmm.
this exaltation of democracy, but in the end, they it's something that you talk about and it's not necessarily something that you enact.
Hmm.
And the restored republic and then the
Hmm.
porfiriato will be its politicians will be happy to deal with this indirect. It's
Hmm.
less indirect than it was because it
Right.
used to be indirect in two phases and now it's only indirect in one, and there's this abstraction of the electoral circumscript district.
Hmm.
um, so it's a more democratic system than it was, but they still are not willing to just go to direct democracy.
Hmm.
Well, not even direct, right, because they never think of direct democracy, but of more a more
Hmm.
democratic um, a more democratic
Hmm.
electoral system, which you do see in Argentina, you
Hmm.
do see in Chile, So that I think is an interesting
Hmm.
no?
Yeah, good theory, practice
Mhm.
a little different. And we kind of talked a lot about the kind of way we organize this, the kind of or electoral system, the kind of envisioning. But I think one factor we briefly want to talk about too is this perception in Mexico, and sort of as a result, is very common in other parts of the New World as well, that it seems that centralization is crucial, right? That more power needs to be centered in Mexico City. Um, and it seems Mexico has a long history of that already, considering it. I'm familiar with it starting with Santa Anna, but you probably can correct me and say it starts even before Santa Anna implements some of that.
I think that throughout the 19th century, after the War of Independence,
Mhm.
which loosened the dominion of Mexico City, and what happens in the rest of Spanish America is that the War of Independence is fought against colonial rule, but
Mhm.
also against the dominating cities. No, you
Mhm.
have
Mhm.
these cities that
Yeah.
do not want to submit to Lima, do not want to submit to
Mhm.
Buenos Aires. In Mexico, you have the centralization of New Spain is more pervasive than, let's say, Central America, no, where you
Hmm.
do have at first a union and then the capitals
Hmm.
say, no, we do not want a Central American republic. We want to have
Hmm.
our own autonomy. I think it has to do, among other things, with the that the link to overseas trade is basically one port, which is Veracruz.
Very
So
true. Yeah.
other cities that would compete with Mexico City don't necessarily have
Hmm.
the economic autonomy
Hmm.
to be on their own. But you do have the regionalization of politics
Hmm.
that will be very um, pervasive
Hmm.
throughout the century. So federalism is the system that works, no?
Hmm.
Because but what once people are in power, so once liberal federalists are in
Hmm.
power, they do want to have more control
Hmm.
of,
Yeah.
of the nation, and they will. Juarez will, rely on declaring a state of siege,
Hmm.
on suspending powers in the as Congress for emergency powers in order to intervene. And what we will see by the end of the century is Porfirio Diaz successfully establishing himself, so that the
Hmm.
personal side of it makes it complicated,
Right.
as an arbiter of disputes. So
Hmm.
in the different regions, they will look to the president to kind of resolve things, and that centralizes that centralizes politics. But the basic federal structure has to remain and has to operate. Um, this changes in the 20th century. I basically I think for fiscal reasons. My colleagues might think that I am greatly simplifying very very complicated processes. But once the federal government is the one that captures the money from taxes and distributes it, then it's easier to be a highly centralized political system. But the political beans during the 19th century are cooked in the regions.
Hmm.
No?
Yeah. Good. And so, like, I want to slowly draw to the close, and I kind of wanted to wonder a bit with you about the word choice for this period, because we have obviously Empire period, we have the Reform War period, and it's English or Mexican, Spanish words, but uh, it feels like from what I've read in your book and what we've talked about here for the last hour and a little bit, I'm sort of a little bit reminded of works on the 1688 revolution in Great Britain by Steve Pincus or Tim Harris, and the thought process that what you're having here is two visions that both want the country to advance, both want the country to positively move forward. It's just very different directions in which we're going. So, kind of the question being, should we maybe think of this as sort of a revolution in Mexico?
And a revolution in the States?
Sure, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, me too. No, I do think that the basic premises of politics um, change in an important way. I think the structures. Now, who is the representative of
Hmm.
the sovereign people? And I think that in both cases, despite all of these conditioning elements that we have mentioned, is the federal government, and
Hmm.
that does engender this nation state. I
Hmm.
find Charles Myers'
Hmm.
definition of it, the territorial bound, that there is this idea of a national market and national economy. I do think that it gels in on both sides of the
Hmm.
border, and that it kind of looks what we have now. No,
Hmm.
the map looks
Hmm.
like what we have now, and the
Yeah.
the the, the essential um, machinery
Hmm.
of how this representative government works
Yeah.
is solidified. The much looser
Mhm.
arrangements that followed independence
Mhm.
have become have faded away,
Mhm.
no, and are replaced by this more centralized. And this centralization is based on this new idea of what it means to be a citizen
Mhm.
and what that entails.
Yeah, no, I like that. That definitely is sort of a good way of thinking of that entire period. And I think it applies in other places in the Americas as well during this era. So as a kind of final question for the night, in your case day, in my case slowly night, um, I kind of was wondering because we started, I want to come kind of full circle with this. We started sort of thinking about public memory and how when I ask you about how's this period thought about in Mexico, we kind of drifted into public memory. And I'm familiar, I'm at least aware of that you have in Puebla as a monument to Zaragoza and the Cinco de Mayo battle. But maybe let's think about like in the US, sort of the second part of your book, which we ignored for people knows that hopefully. Uh, there's tons of monuments. There's tons of statues. There's battlefield parks. Obviously, the US is a little bit unique in that battlefield park kind of thing. Um, but I kind of wanted to think with you about this is a very important moment for Mexico. And I guess, is Mexico commemorating it in the public space properly or enough from your perspective? Or do you feel like Mexico should do more putting up statues or monuments or reminders of this really important period?
I think that we've come to a point where we should not be thinking about statues
Mm-hmm.
as and we,
Mm-hmm.
there's this whole discussion about what we do with the old ones, no?
Yes.
But I think Mexican memory is the heroes
Mm-hmm.
of the Reform and French intervention wars are the national heroes. Benito
Mm-hmm.
Juarez, who it's interesting because he's a civilian,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
is unquestionably no the figure from history that is most familiar to Mexicans.
Mm-hmm.
You have no at least one street, one school, one plaza in every Mexican town and city that is named
Named after.
after Benito Juarez.
Mm-hmm.
Zaragoza, no, this very young
Mm-hmm.
general who manages to push back the French, is also present. And it's interesting because he is obviously in Puebla, but because he was a northerner, no, he's
Mm-hmm.
also in Saltillo, he's also in Monterrey. The Mexico City's main avenue is Avenida Reforma,
Yeah.
and the every state had to send two of its most eminent citizens. Many of them are Republican heroes.
Mm.
I think that in this sense, Mexico did a better job than the US did.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah, well, I think the equivalent to that is like the statue gallery, which is in the old House chamber
mhm,
in Washington, but it's
mhm.
like there's some odd choices of statues that have gone into that over the years.
Yeah. No, and what is interesting from someone looking at it from
Mm,
the outside, and what is even more interesting is
well,
that in this very contentious discussion, this doesn't really come up, is that there are so many statues to Confederate generals.
no, yes.
And it's should do I think we need to be as historians
Mm,
the as objective as we can to not demonize our historical
mm,
actors, etc. All of that I think is
mhm,
absolutely no, and people assume that you're maybe a monarchist and a conservative. They're probably wrong, but it's just part of the life of a historian.
mhm,
But I don't, I certainly don't think we need a statue for Miguel Miramon, no, the conservative general, or
mhm.
Maximilian. No,
Mhm.
Maximilian has a very nice chapel
Mhm.
at the Cerro de las Campanas, which is where he was executed.
Mhm.
That was built by the Austrian government
Mhm.
through this personal arrangement between Porfirio Diaz and one of
Mhm.
Maximilian's generals, Karl Hüller, who was a Hungarian. Um, what is it that we want to
Mhm.
glorify? And
Right.
I think that the conservatives and the imperialists, because not all imperialists were conservatives, not all
Yeah. Mhm.
conservatives were imperialists, they acted in good faith,
Mhm.
yes, but do we want to
Right.
glorify or
Mhm.
no? I think we need to tell their story.
Mhm.
I don't think we need to have civic ceremonies or put
Mhm.
have statues where people should go. And no, I
Yeah.
think that history is to be discussed, history is to
Mhm.
be understood,
Yeah.
hopefully learned from,
Mhm.
but it's not to be glorified or
Mhm.
judged or so in terms of memory, I think we've done okay. And I do think that this um because people acted in good faith and did heroic deeds does not
Mhm.
necessarily need to be translated into a statue.
Yeah. No, I,
We
I,
need to
I
talk
I
about
can agree with that.
what they stood for, and what
Mhm.
do we
Yeah.
want for
Mhm.
the future. So I'd much rather have complicated museum exhibits. I'd much
I
rather
agree.
have stories for children that are
Mhm.
but statues, because
Yeah.
statues, I mean, I love the murals, Mexican
Mhm.
murals,
Oh yes.
who are the idea of the mural is to give,
Mhm.
it's to be a history lesson.
Right.
But it
Mhm.
is, good against bad, heroes against villains,
Mhm.
and, they're beautiful,
Right.
or at least very impressive.
Mhm.
Is it what I think we should be doing now? No, it made sense in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s,
Mhm.
but now,
We don't need. And just as a follow-up to this, because I lived for a year in Austria, and towards the end of that year, I encountered a group of, I don't even remember the exact names. I think they were dragoons. Like
mhm,
they dressed in like these old imperial uniforms, and there was like groups all across the country who kind of celebrated the old empire and
mhm.
kind of it almost felt like they wanted to bring back the Austro-Hungarian emperor a little bit. Are there any groups like that in Mexico?
Yes.
Okay.
Very small, very marginal.
Yeah,
But
there's
again,
still some. All right.
there is this very romantic
Mm-hmm.
vision of Maximilian, and people
Mm-hmm.
who go to Vienna
Mm-hmm.
often visit and often take him visit his, it's not a gravesite, I guess, because it's in the Capuchin crypt.
Mm-hmm.
But it is this kind of romantic pilgrimage. They do the same with Porfirio
Oh,
Diaz in Paris,
oh,
which
yeah.
I think is totally fine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do they want to bring the empire back? Probably not. They have masses for
Mm-hmm.
Maximilian's the anniversary of his death. Um, and on the other hand, no, just one of the reasons that I studied the Second Empire is my grandfather, who was Hungarian,
Mm-hmm.
was a defender of the Habsburg regime. He said
Right.
it worked very well
Mm-hmm.
because it brought people who were different together. And now you have, I shouldn't say this. He'll probably be looking down and say, don't make me look. But you have these ridiculous countries like these small Central European countries, which he thought shouldn't exist because it just makes
Mm-hmm.
more sense to have markets. But anyway, that's he certainly did not want to bring it
Mm-hmm.
back. But this imperial nostalgia,
Yeah.
no, I
Yeah.
think that is kind of inevitable. It doesn't make
Mm-hmm.
much, I think, sense in terms of of a political project.
No, no, especially not a complicated one like this one has been. Well, at this stage, I think we have talked long and have covered so much ground. There's still so much in the book to explore. It's a really interesting study. I'm probably will have to read it a second time at least to get everything and all the beautiful details in it. So first of all, thank you so much for taking so much time this morning and to talk about the book.
No, thank you, Neil. It's been a pleasure.
You are welcome. And for those who are interested, the book is Torn Asunder, Republican Crises and Civil Wars in the United States and Mexico, 1848 to 1867, from the University of North Carolina Press.